Christmas. So thanks for being here. I'll start with maybe a quick recap of what we talked about last week, and then we're going to focus in on the 10 Commandments this week, or what I'll call the 10 words, because I'm enough of a language geek to like to point out when we can translate things slightly differently. So apparently the Hebrew that we translate as commandment is perhaps most literally translated just word. So these are the 10 words of God to Israel. So I'm calling the class overall bearing God's name. And I got the idea from this book, but you don't need the book. We're just going to make it a textual class where we look at the text every week. But if anybody's curious, kind of where I got the idea, it's this PhD Carmen Imes, who wrote her dissertation on particularly that commandment, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain, which is what we're going to focus in on today. But we're going to trace it through. So last week we kind of looked at the Exodus as the context for the event on Mount Sinai. This week we're going to zero in on Mount Sinai, and especially the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words from God. And then I'm actually out of town next week, so David is going to get to decide what he does. But my idea for the next topic was looking at continuing this through the prophets. So how do the prophets talk about bearing the name of God as they look back on the 10 Commandments and how Israel is doing? And then the last 3 weeks was to look at the New Testament. So Jesus' name, the idea of God's name on us as the church, and all the way into Revelation, where names are really, really important. So we're kind of tracing that idea of what it might mean to bear God's name, to take on God's name, kind of throughout the whole Bible. So last week, we talked about the Exodus, because we said that you can't really understand the law or the covenant outside of the context in which God gave it. So God rescued his people out of slavery in Egypt, brought them into the wilderness, and then after having saved them from Egypt, this was the instruction that he gave them, right? And we talked about this idea of the wilderness being a transitional space, a transitional time. God was forming these people that had been slaves for 400 years into how to be a nation. And so the instruction he gave them at Sinai was really a blessing to them. We can sometimes think of laws as being restrictive. I think in particular for us, nearly 3,000 years later, looking back at some of the Old Testament laws in Leviticus, they seem hard to understand. That's often not our favorite part of a read through the Bible in a year project, is getting through, Numbers and Leviticus and things like that.
And
but
names.
Yeah. But to these people, this was a blessing, because, the peoples around them often assumed they didn't really know what their gods wanted. And if you were suffering, you may not know which God was mad at you or why or what to do about it. But to the people of Israel, they knew Yahweh was close to them. He had given them his instruction. He made the covenant clear, right? They knew what he wanted, and they knew what he was going to do, and that he would be faithful, and that they could trust their God. So this instruction on how to be a nation that could live long and be fruitful and prosper in the land was a joyful blessing to them to have this word from God. And then we looked at Psalm 119, which I think is the longest chapter in the Bible. It's a single psalm that is in praise of God's word. And so we looked a lot about how the people of Israel praised the word of God, but in particular, we zeroed in, at least one of the things we commented on was this verse 45. So Psalm 19:45, the psalmist says, "I will walk about in freedom, for I have sought out your precepts." And we started to talk a little bit about this connection between the idea of law and freedom, because often I think we see some of these Old Testament laws in particular, and maybe all laws, even our current country's laws, as restrictions, right? Laws are things you cannot do, that you can get in trouble for doing. Thou shalt not, right? And so why is this psalmist saying, because of your precepts, I get to walk around in freedom, right? What is it about God's law that actually gives him freedom? And there's a quote from Imes in this book that says, true freedom requires clearly communicated boundaries. And we talked about that a little bit. I think Jaleesa had talked about, as a photographer, as she understands the boundaries of what her equipment can do and how things work. Here's Jaleesa. I'm talking about this freedom, knowing the boundaries, right? So when you understand the boundaries of whatever it is you're doing, then you can exercise freedom within it. So I thought maybe we'd pause there for a second George, you asked me after class, like, I'm curious to see what all you're going to do with Psalm 19 and freedom. And I don't know what all to do with Psalm 119 and freedom. But I thought I'd just give you all a little open space again to talk about this idea. And then I do have a couple other thoughts I want to point to. But as we think about law and freedom, what do you think? How do they go together or not? Like, what is the tension, right? How does this work? Okay, your hand first, Alpha, I think.
Yes, sir. All right. My ideal, and it comes straight from the Bible, of course. So my ideal about freedom is that you can do no. That's a good question. Because I mean, you're free to wake up, you're free to do what's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have boundaries, then you know what not to do.
Okay.
Right? Let's take stealing, for instance, and I think I used this last week, where you know that it's wrong to steal. That should be innate. But if you don't follow the law of the land, for instance, then you know you're going to get in trouble for it. You're not just going to get away with it. You may, but not for long.
Okay.
So that's where Yahweh's laws come into play, into action. To be obedient is to be free. You don't have to have a worry. You don't have to have any concerns of if you're doing this wrong or if you're doing this right. You stay on that straight line of obedience.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought about not having to worry. As a parent, as I've looked into various things about parenting, one of the things you hear is that especially young kids really need clearly understood rules,
Yeah.
because otherwise they feel unsafe, right? If you can know that you don't have to worry because you have good law, good rule, then you feel less anxiety, less worry, right? More clarity.
Yeah.
I like the first two verses of Psalm 119. It kind of, what it does, it differentiates, if I said that right, you from other people.
Mm-hmm.
Then it gives you, it puts you in a position where you are in line with God or pleasing to God when you keep His law.
Mm-hmm.
Because listen to verse 1 and 2, it says joyful. That word right there. Are people of integrity who follow the instructions of the Lord.
Yeah.
So it gives you joy, peace, separation from people that don't or do not follow God's law.
Yeah.
You are in a position where you're pleasing to your God.
Yeah.
And you're joyful about that because you want your parents to be happy and pleased with you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I like that verse also uses the word instruction, because the Hebrew word here is Torah, which you've probably heard. That's what they call the first 5 books. So, the Bible, the Torah. But you can also translate that not just as law, but as instruction. And so again, if I go back to parenting, if you think you have kids and you want them to grow up, and once they leave your home to have the freedom to do what they want in life, to accomplish things, whatever freedom you would want them to have as an adult, do you think they're going to have a better chance of that with or without some instruction from you, right? I mean, we sometimes think of freedom as this idea that you can just do whatever you want, complete openness to any choice. But we know we can't always accomplish whatever we want. We don't always have every possible path in front of us, right? If you have instruction and wisdom and guidance to help you grow in maturity into a full life, then you actually have the freedom to do more things, right? And I think that's what God's trying to help them do.
The opposite would be anarchy.
Right. Yeah, all right, I see a couple hands there on that side.
When you mentioned the word maturity, and that was what I was going to say earlier, you have to have a certain state, go through certain stages of maturity to accept law and freedom. Because as again, bringing up the parenting, most kids think that you have no freedom. You don't let me do this. You don't let me go there, especially, when you're that tween to whenever. But you have to develop certain stages of maturity to be able to accept that, this is freedom, because most kids, think that, you're mean and you're not letting them do this or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing, maturity level, as a Christian. You don't really understand why, why you can't do this or, say, people seem to think there's a bigger no list than there is a bigger yes list. You have to reach a certain stage of maturity to understand the freedom with having laws.
Good.
Just my thought. Law and freedom to me go hand in hand. You can't have one without having the other, because you wouldn't know what to do, what not to do, and why you're not supposed to do thus and so. So I believe that's a given. You can't separate them both.
I would say the comparison of the child and the parent is very appropriate when you're talking about the commandments that were given as they were developing a new nation. They were becoming this new thing. And so God was giving them this structure to live within, which, they knew that not only were they protected, but also God had their back as long as they were. So that's I think that's pretty appropriate.
The funny thing about that, to back up Mr. Clark here, is that Israel was new and babies. They were ignorant, but they knew the law. They heard it from Moses, and they still disregarded it. They made a calf. Come on, how crass can you be?
Yeah, that was pretty bad. So Lisa, I saw your hand.
Just wanted to share a little perspective maybe from the child's point of view that I remember, and that played a role for me. So to make a long story short, I used to be a bus kid. I rode the bus to church. Old Church of Christ door knocking came to my house, and that's how I got to church. And my parents did not go to church. So I would learn in the classroom, Jesus loves you. And there was a point during my teen years that my dad thought, you're not going to church anymore. So I had already learned, love God more than you love anyone. So I actually did go against his rules. Did not
Practice
stay-
some nonviolent civil disobedience thing.
Yeah, I did not, because I knew that the rules over here were better for me. I had learned that. So I thought, well, I'm going to disobey in this regard.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go and enjoy the freedom that I have here. And so that's how I decided to pursue God's laws.
Yeah.
And even now, like as a parent, you might not see Rayo and Linda around here anymore. I've given them the choice. Every morning now, I'm not going to tell you you're going to church. I'm going to ask you if you're going to church. So I want them to feel like they miss it. I want them to become make it their own, where they feel like they can choose that. And it's their freedom, but they've already learned up until this time, we've brought them here all the time, but now it's their choice, and I want them to have that.
I just wanted to say that I was actually looking for the New Testament scripture to help understand that particular verse and walking in liberty. And I think the word liberty is freedom, and of course, 2 Corinthians, where Paul writes and said that these people were bound. We were all bound in sin. We were our minds, our hearts, our free will. We couldn't worship God or walk in any way that was pleasing to the Father because we were bound by sin. But now that Spirit, which is the Lord, had come, He given us freedom and that liberty. And that's what 2 Corinthians 3:17 is saying, that now that it come, now we are free. We can praise God mentally, that's what He wants. We can praise Him physically, by looking after one another. We have the freedom to do it where we're not bound by every time the enemy accuses us of things that were done in the past to prevent us from walking, living, acting, performing our daily duties. Now we are free, and we can praise God the way He wants to.
Yeah. Thanks. All right.
Just thinking of freedom, kind of in a couple perspectives. You'd asked last week about it, in case where you don't know the rules. And one thing that I was thinking was, playing games with my grandkids. You know, because you're doing things and you think you're doing right, but they're kind of making up the rules as they go along. They're constantly getting corrected and brought back in line. But the other thing too is that freedom is, you can look at it from an individual perspective, but you could also look at it from a community perspective as well. And I think with the law, the freedom came to the community because they knew that everyone was following those commands and those precepts. You imagine what it'd be like driving down the highway if we didn't have laws that said, okay, you drive on the right-hand side of the road, you drive this speed, you turn. You know, because if you had people driving 5 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour on the same lane, it kind of creates havoc, or not everybody going in the same direction, that creates havoc. So we have that, in a way, we kind of have freedom because we know that everybody is adhering to these same precepts and these same laws.
What's that refrain in the book of Judges? Everyone did what they thought was right in their own hearts. Good. All right. Great thoughts. I'm going to move us along a little bit and we'll start to do some of the geeky textual translation stuff of this week. Maybe one last kind of comment on the idea of law and freedom is I did see one commentator, and I liked this idea, say that you can understand the Ten Commandments as the bill of other people's rights. So part of our law that gives us freedom in this country is we have a Bill of Rights, right? Now, we chose to state those in terms of what right does the individual have. You have a right to this, you have a right to that. The Ten Commandments kind of states it the other way, but it's really the same thing, right? If I have a right to life, thou shalt not murder, all right? If we have a right to property, thou shalt not steal. And so in a sense, while we can hear that thou shalt not and think God is just restricting me, one of the things he's doing is he's protecting the rights of his people. Right? If you're a child of God, then I can't steal from you, right? And we're all children of God. I mean, in particular, he's making a covenant community here, but he's concerned about everyone. And in order to protect those rights, he's got to create these guidelines so that we don't violate one another's rights and freedoms.
Jason, it's one of the things that our civil rights entitle us to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness means you may do anything you wish that makes you happy, as long as you don't interfere with somebody else's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, you might have that brand new Mercedes 600 V12 that I'd like, you know, it would make me happy to take it. Well, but it wouldn't make you happy for me to take it from you. So we do that. I'm reminded of a little boy who came back to Allen at the Hillcrest Church of Christ there. His family had been away for several years, and he came back and of course they were introducing their little 4-year-old boy to one of the elderly ladies there. And she went up to him and shook his hand and smiled and said in her elderly Texas drawl, "Are you a good little boy?" And he looked up at her and said, "Well, it's hard being good all the time." And I thought, yeah, well, it don't get any easier.
He's an honest little boy. Yeah. Just to clarify, I do not have a Mercedes V12. That does sound fun. Yeah, I think I've heard it said that like the rights of your fist stopped at my nose.
Yeah,
something like that.
Well, even in the days of the caveman, you know, the rule was might makes right. And if your cave is bigger than mine and I got a bigger family than yours, if I can run you out of there, I can take it. Well, if you're going to live in a civilized society, even if you have no concept of God, you know, you can't just go around taking anything you want anytime you want it when it belongs to somebody else. People began to realize, even on their own, you can't live like that. And so they have social contracts where I agree not to take what's yours if you agree not to take what's mine.
Yeah.
But they did that in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they did. They took what they wanted, even though it did not belong to them.
Yeah, so I've been listening to the Bible Project podcast, which is a fascinating podcast to me if y'all like podcasts. But one of the themes they traced is if you go all the way back to Eve, when she ate of the fruit, it says she saw something that looked appealing to her, and she took and she ate. And that kind of phraseology runs throughout the whole Old Testament. People see something that they want, they take it. And sin is that pattern over and over and over again, right? I mean, you see it in the book of Judges. Somebody sees, it looks appealing to them, they take, right? I mean, yeah. All right. Well, let's keep moving because I do have a bunch of slides I got to drag you through
I just want to
today.
say something right quick. Eve was persuaded because she had been there long before Satan had attempted her.
Mm-hmm.
But once he attempted her, then she was able to open her eyes to see it. She probably saw it, but didn't really see it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's look at some of the commandments. I'm going to start with this one because it's sort of where we get the name of the class. I often like the NASB, the New American Standard, but in particular, I picked it here because it still uses that "take the name of the Lord" that I think many of us are familiar with, right? So if we're going to say the commandments out loud, a lot of people would word it as, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." And I've always found that commandment to be a little bit puzzling because, these are the big 10, right? Like, these are really big deal commandments. And is all God getting at here that I shouldn't use his name as a curse word, right? Or some people say, well, it's about oaths, right? Don't use the name of your God in an oath and then not do what you promised to do, which I think that makes a little bit more sense to me. But is that all that's going on here? And so that's what Professor Imes here did her dissertation on, was looking at the word. So the Hebrew word is nasah. And so we can see this in some other locations in the Bible too. It's not used only here, but it says, "You shall not nasah the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who nasah his name." And that word, and here's the actual Hebrew characters for anybody else who's geeky enough to care. The most literal translation is to bear, to lift up, or to carry. And so it's, I think, pronounced something like Nassau, but it's also fascinating to me that to lift up is NASA. So, right? Rocket, it's lifted up. So, don't lift up the name of the Lord your God in vain.
Make it.
But they make NASA is an idol for the people who work there. They worship their job.
Possibly, we all can. But so let's look a little bit more at what Nassau means, because what would it mean to lift up the name of your God in vain, right? I think that's why people have gone to this idea of take the name of the Lord your God in vain. It's got to have something to do with speech, right? We don't carry names around generally, but maybe they're talking about cursing, maybe they're talking about oaths. So what do we do with this definition of bear or carry? And so just a little bit later in Exodus 28, there's this long, deep passage about the high priest's clothing. So it's another one of those ones that can be a little bit hard to read. I mean, I'm not that interested in how you need to embroider his turban and stuff like that, but it goes through all those details. But one of the things that it says in verses 17 through 21 is that you make a row that has rows that have 12 precious stones on them. And each of the precious stones have a name of one of the tribes of Israel. And those go on his chest plate. And so the high priest is literally carrying around the names of the tribes when he goes into the temple. And so here, verse 29, Aaron's the high priest at the time. It says, "So Aaron shall nasah the names of the sons of Israel in the breastpiece of judgment over his heart when he enters the holy place, as a memorial before the Lord continually." So we see that same name, to carry or to bear. Aaron the high priest is going to bear the names of Israel when he goes into the holy place to meet with Yahweh. And then if anybody noticed my little graphic I had on the cover page for the last 2 weeks, it has to do with this verse. So the one other thing that I think is interesting about his clothing is later in verses 36 through 38, it says, "You shall also make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it, like the engravings of a signet, holy, belonging to Yahweh. You shall fasten it on a violet cord, and it shall be on the turban. It shall be at the front of the turban. It shall be on Aaron's forehead." So on his chest, when he goes before God, he bears the names of Israel. He carries the names of the tribes of Israel before God. But as the high priest, he also bears the name of Yahweh on his forehead. He literally has something on his head that says belonging to Yahweh, the name Yahweh on him. Okay, we'll get to that one in a second. I moved forward a little too fast because we're going to start to talk about what it means about Israel. But if you think back about what priests did in the Old Testament, what comes to mind? What was the point of a priest, a regular priest or a high priest? What was kind of the role of the priest? What did they do?
They offered sacrifice.
Sacrifices, yeah, that's good. It's true.
Consecration.
What's that?
Consecration.
Consecration, yeah, made things holy. They had various rituals of consecration. Any other?
They're kind of leaders of worship to God.
Yeah, they led the worship. Yeah, good.
Intercessions.
Intercession, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Mediators.
Mediators, yeah, that's a good word. I like that. So, yeah, all good things. I had a few notes. One that I noted was the priest is someone who is set apart. that's, I can't go backwards with my mouse, I don't think. But if you remember that prior verse, it says his thing on his head says holy, belonging to Yahweh. So that's the kind of the meaning of holy, right? It's set apart. So that the high priest is set apart as a special role for God. I had mediator, so they mediate between God and man. And that's one of the places where I think this idea of carrying the names becomes important, because what the high priest does is he both represents the people to God, but he also represents God to the people. So Aaron, in this case, as the high priest, is bearing the names of Israel, and he's bearing the name of Yahweh. He is representing both. And then he also, the high priest is the one that gives the blessing. I think somebody said something about that. So y'all probably know the famous blessing of "May his face shine upon you." We still sing that as a song. We'll look at that in a second. But the priests were to mediate out blessings to the people, the blessings of Yahweh. And so here we've got a verse that sort of broadens it from just the priest to the whole nation, right? It says, God says to the people of Israel, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So he was instructing Moses to tell them that. And so I like that because I see the same kind of things, right? Like the high priest is, or all the priests are holy, set aside, set apart as special, but the entire nation is a holy nation, right? Israel is set apart from the pagans. That's one of the main purposes of the law, was to make it obvious that they're different, right? You walk through Israel and you see like they don't look or act or anything like the Canaanites around them, right? They're different. But they're also a kingdom of priests. So, I mean, what do you think? What does that mean? If the priests are the special ones that represent Israel to God, God to Israel, then they have priests. So, what does it mean for the whole nation then to be priests?
Yeah, and he did want Israel. I mean, according to Romans, he did want Israel to be that example to the world, to go out and draw the world back to him. And Israel didn't do it. So he says that before you make up your mind to follow me, to represent me, to lift me up, just make sure that your mind is set. This is what you want to do. Because if not, and he warned them that through you, you're causing all the enemies to blaspheme me. Because you say you are representing me, and you're my representative, and you are not. And Israel went another direction. God had to go and get Israel and bring Israel back. And so that's a whole kingdom of priests. You imagine it?
Yeah.
Wow, a whole kingdom of priests.
Yeah.
That's what we are.
Yahweh or Yahuwah calls us to be a royal priesthood. So we're royalty, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Yahuwah is sovereign. He's over all. He just stated the whole world is his. You have to be the CEO, right? The owner, of something to say those words. You can't just be a low level and say, yeah, this is mine. It's not. So yeah, we're a royal priesthood.
And Jason, God himself chose Aaron. He had told Moses who he wanted to be in the priesthood. And they were separated. And he did tell Moses step by step what to do to make his attire for them to wear.
Yeah. I feel like I ignore this half of the room sometimes. Any comments over here? All right. Let's look at one more kind of about this. So I said we'd look at that priestly blessing. So the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. So they will put my name on the Israelites and I will bless them." So I haven't read that verse as often, right? We love this section because we sing it. But if we're talking about bearing the name, like there pretty explicitly, Yahweh says, I'm putting my name on the Israelites. And so anyway, long story short, that's why this book is called what it is. And that's why I call the class bearing the name, right? We're used to saying you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. But I'm trying to make the argument, as Professor Imes did here, that maybe a better understanding is that you should not bear the name of Yahweh in vain. You, the people of God, should not carry his name in vain. What do you think? What does that mean to you?
I mean, the vein, I had to look it up and remind myself
Mm.
because I keep, thinking of the word in vain, but that means useless.
Mm-hmm.
So that shows you're carrying it uselessly.
Yeah.
And when something is, I don't respect things that I feel like it's useless to me, and I'm not feeling like there's real power there. I think he's asking us not to forget that he is powerful and we have power due to that.
Yeah.
I think it takes a lot of faith for us. He's asking us for our, it's a decision
Mm-hmm.
that you will have the faith to believe that you have power because of me. So don't take me uselessly.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned before that,
on serpents, yeah.
that I heard Marshall Keeble one time say that if you have to tell people you're a Christian in order for them to know it, chances are you're not.
Yeah, I like that. I've heard you say that before. It's a good one.
Pretending to be a Christian when
Yeah.
you don't act like
Well,
you belong.
Yeah, and that's what it would have meant to the Israelites too. Like if you say you're the people of Yahweh, but you don't look any different than the pagans around you, then that's in vain. That's useless, right? And when their sin and their idolatry gets bad enough that God lets them go into exile, the words you hear the prophets say over and over again is, you have profaned the name. Like, why are we going into exile? You have profaned the name of God. It's their actions, their behavior, the way they've lived has brought shame on God's name rather than glory on God's name, right? They've lived in a way that has not glorified God and had the Gentiles know that Yahweh was great, but instead has had the opposite effect of bringing, a negative perception on the people of God and therefore on their God. All right.
I kind of think sometimes it's like sometimes people get into the topic. Well, I know there's not anything I can do for you, but I'll just pray.
Mm.
Hey, wait a minute, you got that switched.
Yeah. Don't act like prayer is in vain either.
Right.
Yeah.
Prayer that is powerful, and people they don't realize what they're saying, I think.
Yeah. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left. I think I'm going to go ahead and walk through something that is, it's interesting to me. I don't know if it's relevant enough to dig you through this or not, because I don't even know for sure if I agree with where she went on this, but to me, it's an interesting idea. It's how do you count the 10 Commandments? And that might seem like a dumb question because, of course, there's 10. We all say the 10 Commandments. We can list them. But people don't agree. The way that the Jewish people count the 10 Commandments is different. The way Catholics count them, which is mostly continued on with Lutherans as well, is different. And then the way that the Reformed churches following John Calvin typically count them is yet again a little different. They're all similar, but there's some little nuanced differences. And I don't know if I buy the argument that Dr. Imes makes here, but I find it at least interesting. And if you think what she says is interesting, it could have some impact on how you view the first two commandments, because it has a lot to do with the covenant of God with Israel. So anyway, why would it be hard to count the 10 Commandments? And it's because in the original text, they looked a little like this. So ancient Hebrew had no uppercase and lowercase, no vowel symbols, and no punctuation. So this is obviously the English text, but I took out all the vowels, all the punctuation, and made it all caps. And then God spoke, I already don't remember what it is, these words. And so that's what we're dealing with here. And if you start to kind of separate it out, it looks maybe a little like this. So sorry for the small font, but if you make everything that looks like a different sentence in Hebrew its own thing, there's at least 12. So I am the Lord your God. Jews are the only ones that count that as part of the commandments. Most Christians say, well, that's just a prologue, it's an intro, it's not really a commandment. But it's a sentence there, right? You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not worship them I combined it, sorry. I should have made this 13, because you shall have no other gods before me is clearly a commandment, right? So there's, I am the Lord your God. That might just be a preamble, but then you shall have no other gods before me is clearly the first commandment, right? You shall not make an idol. You shall not worship them or serve them, which is, almost everybody groups those together, but we'll talk about the grammar here in a second. You shall not take the name of your Lord and your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath, honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, etc. So those two are easy to group together because they're both coveting.
Yeah.
Although grammatically in Hebrew, it looks like it's two sentences, which is okay. A single commandment could be two sentences. Some people would also love to not have wife in the same category as house, like, don't covet your neighbor's property, which by the way includes his wife. So like maybe we would like to separate those out, but I don't know for sure.
But in their time, they were property.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, so here's a common way. A lot of times people put, did I do this right? I don't know if this is the most common. Yeah, I guess so. So this whole no, I did it wrong. This is supposed to shift up. So one common way, let me see if I did it right on the next page. All right. I think I did that wrong. One common way to do it would be, have no other gods before me, don't make an idol, and then don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. But this is another possibility that Dr. Imes argues for, because if you look at the grammar, you shall have no other gods before me is plural. Do not make an idol is singular. And then do not worship them is plural. So if you say the first commandment is have no other gods before me, and the second commandment, most commonly people will group these two together, is don't make any idols and don't worship them. That's possible, but grammatically, the them actually doesn't match up to the idol.
Why not?
Because it's singular, and idol, don't worship them.
That, but if you're looking at the Israelites when they made the calf, and Aaron was in charge of that, Aaron is the one that they're really worshiping, not just the calf. Because Aaron
Well, first
said,
of all, I'm not sure I agree, but
Okay.
also we're looking at just grammar here. So the way that the way language works, right, is usually when you have a pronoun is the right thing I'm talking about here, right? When you have a pronoun, it's supposed to have number agreement with its antecedent. So if you're going to say don't worship them, it should have been don't make idols, plural, and don't worship them if those two go together. So one possibility is that the do not worship them is going back to have no other gods before me. So have no other gods, plural, before me and don't worship them. But then that would imply that maybe we ought to group all of this together because this is going back to that. And what Dr. Imes says is in the ancient culture, the only reason you would ever have an idol is to worship it. And the only way the people around Israel worshiped their gods was with idols. So all of this is sort of one concept. Like, don't have gods before Yahweh. Don't have gods in front of Yahweh. Don't make idols. Don't worship them. All of that goes hand in hand. Like the way you would have a god in front of Yahweh is by worshiping it. The way you would worship a god is by having an idol. And so I think there's some logic to that these are all sort of talking about similar things, right? Then in order to get to just having 10, you would have to, or if you group all those together, in order to still have 10, you would need to keep the two coveting ones separate. So don't covet your neighbor's stuff, which is an inanimate object, and then don't covet your neighbor's living things that are sort of a part of his household, which it's still maybe a little weird to group wife and ox in the same sentence, but maybe that's one way we can do it.
Jason?
Yeah.
Just quick, where he said, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, that was one of the laws. But the first thing a person would say, why not?
Mhm.
Why? So then he goes and he said, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless. And that's in the King James. And if you take his name in vain. See, he's given them an explanation besides.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, explanations are definitely in there. So real quick, because this is my last slide, and then I'll take comments as long as y'all, or questions or whatever, as long as y'all want to stay. But the one reason I think that grouping could be interesting is if you group all of those first three statements together into the first commandment, don't have any gods before Yahweh, don't make an idol, don't worship them, then really the first commandment is basically worship only Yahweh. And that would make the second commandment, don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for, I'm your God, you're my people. Carry, or as Dr. Imes would argue, don't carry or bear God's name uselessly. In other words, represent God well. Be the people of God and carry his name in a good way, not a vain way. And so you could say the first two commandments are worship only Yahweh and represent him well. And if you look at how they talk about the covenant over and over and over again in the Bible, it's basically, I will be their God, they will be my people. Right? And when they start to break the commandments, go into exile, the prophets say this over and over again. Jeremiah and Ezekiel talking about renewing the covenant and bringing the people of Israel back, and then the new covenant as well. Jeremiah 24:7 says, I will give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord. They will be my people, and I will be their God, for they will return to me with all their heart. And Ezekiel 11:20 says, then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. And so, I don't know for sure how we have to group the Ten Commandments. I don't know if it matters that much in the end. But what I like about this idea of the first two being Yahweh is your God, represent him well, is it follows the covenant pattern of, the two big things are, I'm your God, you're my people, right? And that's the starting point for everything else well. And I expect you to represent me well. Now, here's some ideas on how you do it. Don't steal, don't murder, don't covet, right? But the bottom line is, I'm your God, you're my people, have only me, carry my name well. Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what more could they have wanted God to do, because he said, just do these things, I'll bless you. He's going to take care of them. He said, I am your God, I'm the Lord your God. I hold you by your right hand. Don't be afraid. I will take care of you. That's his commandment. And you wonder what more could they have wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard the golden staff story described as committing adultery on the wedding night. Right? I mean, God's literally giving them the covenant at that point, and they're already making idols, right?
That's right. And Jason, just quickly, that they were in Egypt for 400 years. They learned a lot. I mean, that nation was so strong. They had gods for everything. God for a frog, God for a mosquito.
Yeah.
If the ants ran somebody out of town, they built a god for an ant. But God had to wash their minds and let them know there are not these gods. You can't inside put up, because a banner is the banner always went before, whether they're marching or whether they are in a war. That ensign lifted up as a banner, and he said, don't put me up in vain, and you walking behind me, and I'm going before you, and you stray. So the first 5 commandments were dealing with him, and the last ones were dealing with the people.
Yeah.
The 2 commandments that Jesus said. You love God, and then you love the neighbor as yourself. True. I hope I didn't go crazy.
No.
Nobody got to build a God for me.
Yes, he did.
All right. Well, we're about at 45, so I should probably let y'all go so we can all have time to get over to the worship center on time. Thanks for being here this week. I'll miss you next week. We'll see what David has in store.